Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Professor Norman Cornett, religious studies scholar, art critic, and curator. 35 years ago, I created the dialogic approach to education. The axis of my dialogic approach to education is the arts. Why is that? Because the key to education is creative thinking and creative expression. And the arts enable us to foster, to encourage, to nurture, to develop, in fact, to incite to creative thinking and expression, so that the arts constitute the most valuable means whereby we can create an environment conducive to creative thinking and expression. Dia is a Greek word, and it means between. I believe that education takes place in that interstice between two or more human beings exchanging, dialoguing about a subject. Where do I go when I mention dialogic education? Well, there are two primary sources. One of them is the German philosopher Hegel. Hegel proposed that there is a thesis, there is an antithesis, and you see where I'm coming from. So, between thesis and antithesis, in that interstice, learning takes place. But he proposed that the thesis and antithesis find reconciliation in synthesis. And that's how I believe we learn. When we are in dynamic tension between thesis, antithesis, when we dialogue and share, we come up with learning, with education, with cognitive acquisition. And that's the synthesis. Then we create new thoughts, new ways of thinking, new ways of expressing ourselves. I consider the classroom an environment for laboratory experiments in the technical term of cognitive acquisition. That's the expression for learning. Always the question I ask myself, how do we learn? How could we learn better? And the classroom provides an environment where we can explore cognitive acquisition. We can explore how we learn better. Why is it a laboratory? Because the classroom creates an atmosphere where we can explore, we can discover, we can experiment, and we can do it through all the sensory perceptions that we have. In fact, that's why the arts are crucial to education, to teaching, to learning, because we don't learn just through what we read, we learn through what we see, through what we hear, through what we smell, through what we taste, through what we touch, the tactile sense. So that to all intents and purposes, the classroom is a laboratory for conducting experiments in sensory perception. And that's where the arts come in, because the arts appeal to sensory perception. One of the primary references in my dialogic approach to education lies in the Soviet literary critic Mikhail Bakhtin. Bakhtin wrote a monograph, a series of essays, translated into English, published by the University of Texas Press, entitled The Dialogic Imagination. Now, this became the seed for developing, in my case, a dialogic approach to education. What do I mean by dialogic? Well, we know that the human brain essentially has two hemispheres. One pertains to reason. Another pertains to imagination, or the imaginary. In other words, we have an entire half of our brain devoted to creativity, because that's what imagination is. That's what the imaginary is. So the task in teaching is to build bridges between reason, logic, rationale, hard data, and our creativity, our imagination, our imaginary. I believe, and this is why I call it my dialogic approach to education, created 35 years ago, after referencing Mikhail Bakhtin, was that really the crux of learning takes place when we build within our own mind, within our own brain, an interaction between reason and creativity, between logic and imagination, between data and the imaginary. It's in that interstice that education, that learning, that what's technically called cognitive acquisition takes place. One of the touchstones of my dialogic philosophy of education is John Locke, considered the source of empiricism in the 1600s. John Locke, first and foremost, was a medical physician. And John Locke is the philosopher who proposed the idea that all human beings are tabula rasa. We are all blank slates. So therefore, how does learning take place? How does cognitive acquisition occur? According to John Locke, the physician, doctor, and philosopher, source of empiricism as we know it, it takes place through sensory perception. That is to say, that sight, sound, taste, smell, touch, they all inscribe on the human brain, which means that each and every one of us are what are known as sentient beings. And it's through sensory perception, all of the senses, that we learn that something is written on this blank slate of the human mind. It therefore behooves us in our teaching not to take a reductionistic approach that relies simply on reading and repeating a text, but rather an approach that draws on all of our senses, that appeals to us as sentient beings. How then can we learn through sight? How can we learn through sound? How can we learn through smell? How can we learn through touch? And thereby, ladies and gentlemen, you understand why the arts constitute the axis of my dialogic approach to education, because it is through the arts, all of the arts, from literature to film, that we access the sensory perception whereby we learn. And that's how cognitive acquisition takes place. So again and again, we wish in education to integrate the arts, all of the arts, so that everybody, some students are auditory, some students are visual, some students are tactile, some are olfactory, the second strongest sense in the human brain. We therefore wish to develop a curriculum that entails all of the senses so that we can learn to such an extent that it is imprinted in our brain. And that means including the affective dimension, because we also learn through what we feel. One of the great responsibilities we have in education is forming the young people there in the classroom before us. Often they are like clay. And there's this incredible moment in their lives where we can impact, leave an impression that will last a lifetime. And in fact, when I teach, I don't teach for a quiz. I don't teach for a midterm. I don't teach for a final. I don't teach for an exam. I don't teach for an essay. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't teach for a grade, and I don't teach for a diploma. I teach for life, for what stays with us for the rest of our lives. That's what I call sustainable education, where we remember it till our last breath. Why are the arts important in education today? Because human beings are multisensory creatures. And we know now from neurological studies that children who never learned to write cursively, but only learned to write straight on the keyboard, have left entire areas of the brain untouched. They're not drawing. They're not benefiting from the head-to-hand connection. What do the visual arts do? What does music do? Music creates the head-to-hand connection to open up those spheres of human learning that we can only take advantage of when we realize that the child in kindergarten, that the infant, that in preschool, or the pupil in primary school, or the adolescent and teenager in high school, until we take advantage and call on all of the senses of the human condition and build that connection between the head and the hand, can we really draw on all of the potential of the child. That is the role of the arts, not to leave those areas that we have forgotten, that we have neglected, because we are going straight on to the keyboard. We also know, and this is very important, that music, learning music, opens up neurological synapses that will never take place unless we learn music. Why is that? Because music is an art form that draws on logic, on reason, on rationale, because music is based on mathematics. But at the same time, music draws on creativity, on imagination, on the imaginary. This is our goal, and that's why the arts constitute the touchstone of teaching, because we are full-orbed sensory beings, and it behooves us in education to avail ourselves of all of the senses that each and every child and adolescent and adult has. When we think about teaching, much comes to mind. It could be within the perspective of a job, a career, employment, a steady check, a pension, having summers off, having to work Monday through Friday with the weekends free. But teaching is so much more. I often say that to become a teacher is to realize that we have engaged in a life decision that goes beyond job, employment, check, pension. In fact, it's to realize that we have been entrusted with human beings on whose lives we will have more impact than anyone else other than the parents. And it's for that reason I maintain that teaching, and I say this as a religious studies scholar, teaching is a calling. It's a sense of what I'm on earth to do, to accomplish. What's my mission? I go so far as to say that teaching is therefore sacred, spiritual, because it forms the human spirit. And in that sense, I maintain that teaching, in every sense of the word, including that of religious studies, teaching is a sacred calling. It is a spirit quest. Indeed, teaching is a vocation. The question of sustainability in education is front and foremost in our concerns, particularly in public education today. We're all acutely aware of the phenomenon of burnout. This happens, for example, with young parents, young mothers, for example, taking care of young children, and who again and again, the constant demands made on them. And I'm reminded of what Socrates, the philosopher, said: the life unreflected is not worth living. Is it any wonder then that many teachers, for example, in elementary school or high school, after a few years they can no longer continue. Why is this? Because if the cornerstone of education is creativity, thanks to the arts, creative thinking, and creative expression, when do we create a space for teachers, for educators to renew themselves, to restore themselves, to replenish their creativity, their creative thinking, their creative expression? So that in public education, one of the most important challenges we have lies in creating a space for teachers from pre-K through high school, and indeed in university education, to create a space where they have the opportunity, and I would say the oasis they need to find new strength, new sources of creativity, new fountainheads of creative thinking and creative expression. We need to create an environment in which teachers flourish. They can grow, they can develop, so that they can pass this on in elementary school, in high school, and in the university.